negocio del cambio climático. Hemos visto cómo las conferencias revelando con era Kapman toda la vida. El doctor Blanco, que dio una gran conferencia también, y el doctor Najas, y ayer las conferencias de los estados bien y hoy nos que también son muy importantes, que las va a dar el doctor Benjamín Franta. Manipulación de la ciencia y cambio climático. Aquí tengo el currículo del doctor Franta. Él tiene 31 años, es cantante de coro, es pianista y nació en Waterloo, Iowa, el puro centro de Estados Unidos. Valedictorian de su graduación. Es miembro de muchas organizaciones a su edad y ha hecho, por ejemplo, y una propuesta fue nombrada la más innovativa por el Departamento de Energía. Es de la Sociedad Nacional de Estudiantes de Física y se ganó una beca por su liderazgo. Tiene 2 patentes pendientes en Estados Unidos por asuntos de la física de semiconductores con y ha escrito varios artículos que se va a resumir aquí en esta conferencia sobre los valores en contra de considerar el cambio climático como causado por el hombre y que él ha escrito y le ha traído varias publicaciones en contra de lo que él ha publicado. Entonces los dejo para que disfruten del doctor Benjamín Franta. La conferencia le vamos a dar un poquito más de lo que le damos a todos porque es un poquito larga y vale la pena oírla toda. Entonces le vamos a dar 50 minutos y 5 minutos. Conferencia que también es extremadamente buena. Luego el doctor Lenín Corrales, que es biólogo, que nos va a hablar sobre la biodiversidad. Propulsores de que la gente tenga educación sobre el cambio climático son los médicos. Entonces va a ser
Hola, buenos días. Uh, Gracias por venir esta mañana. Mi nombre es Benjamín en California. Si está bien. So my name is Benjamin Franta, and I'm going to talk about something a little bit different maybe. Climate change and also the politics of climate change. As you may be aware, especially in the United States, the politics about climate change are very but of course, climate change is still very related to human health, as you know. We just saw some big reminders of this recently in the last few months with the hurricane season, a string of really strong and very damaging storms in the United States and the Caribbean. We had Hurricane Harvey first, then Hurricane Irma, and then Hurricane Maria, very close to each other. And of course, Puerto Rico is, and other places too, are having a lot of damage and still having a lot of trouble and recovering as well. But of course, it's not just extreme storms, although extreme storms from climate change, there are one is increased sea levels, so we have higher storm surges, more flooding. The atmosphere is warmer, so there's more precipitation, and when the surface of the ocean is warmer, then hurricanes are often stronger as well. And so for these basic reasons, we expect some of these hurricanes, going forward into the future. But of course, that's not the only impact as well. There are diseases that are carried by mosquitoes, for example. And so we might have in mind how the habitats for different disease vectors are changing, how certain communities that aren't used to being exposed to and how people traveling around might also be carrying and transmitting diseases as well. So a few years ago, I was working in the Philippines and I contracted dengue and chikungunya at the same time. It was really bad luck. How many people in here have either contracted one of these viruses or know somebody else who has? A friend or patient, or know that these diseases, even if they're not fatal, they can have a big impact on people's lives. And so this is a projection that in a scenario where we don't cut back on our use of fossil fuels and our carbon dioxide emissions, by the end of the century, there's a very significant increase in the average temperature here. In some parts of South America, up to 6 degrees Celsius on average. Celsius. And so that's a very significant increase, and that can have a lot of impacts on people who are working, especially people who are working in a conditioned room today, but we don't live in that environment all of the time. And a lot of people hardly ever have that environment to live in. This extreme heat also has a lot of impacts on agriculture. And so this has impacts on people's livelihoods and also the economy of entire countries. And so this is a projection of the impact of just heat, so leaving out extreme storms, leaving out disease vectors, just heat on national economies. But red areas are countries where the national economy is expected to be hurt very much by extreme heat. And you see most of that is in the tropics. And the less by increases in temperature. So as is obvious from this image, the countries that contributed the least to climate change are being hurt by it the most. And the countries that contributed the most to climate change, at least in this impact, are being hurt by it the least. So this is very inequitable, it's very unfair. And this is something else to think about, that this will impact countries' economies for a very long time. So it's very important, both in terms of human health, in terms of national economy, livelihoods, and fairness as well. And of course, we all know that anything that impacts economics will impact human health. People living in poverty have different health outcomes, for example. The impacts of climate change that impact human health. And so we see that today and so we might ask ourselves, how did we get here? How did we get to this point in history where we know about these impacts, they're getting worse, but we don't really seem to be doing much about the problem to address it. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the history of the issue. When we became very sophisticated political campaigns of denial and obstruction to prevent policy action on this problem. I'll talk. This might go back farther than what you might expect. I mean, personally, I didn't even know that climate change was a field of or something like that, which is longer ago than it looks. But it was until very recently. But actually, scientists have known about this issue for a very long time. This is just one example. Engineer named Guy Callender, and in 1938 he published a paper where he asked himself, he said, well, I know that carbon more coal and more oil, how sensitive is the earth to increases in carbon dioxide? And he tried to answer that question. And this graph is essentially his answer, and what it shows is that his estimate was that if we doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we would warm the Earth by about 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. This is a little bit lower than what we think today, but it's surprisingly close to what we think today for how long ago this was. And even at this time, the basic physics behind the greenhouse effect and carbon dioxide was at least theoretically fairly well known. Now, for the next few decades, not much happened until around 1960, and this is when scientists first dioxide in the atmosphere. in sort of a year-on-year way, so they could see if it was changing over time. And they took a lot of these measurements in Antarctica at the South. Well, there's dark and light, but there's not the normal seasons with vegetation growing and dying. And so what you get is very stable levels of carbon dioxide. And so if they change just a little bit, then you can see that at the South Pole. And that's what they found. So here we see from about 1957 to around 1960. And the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing slowly, but is definitely increasing. And because carbon dioxide was already known to be a greenhouse gas, scientists thought immediately, oh, well, this is interesting, but it's potentially a problem as well. The president of the United States at the time, in the 1960s, at this point, Lyndon Johnson, even mentioned this effect. Of nuclear weapons testing and a steady increase in carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. So even at this point, this is the middle of the 1960s, we know that burning fossil fuels is releasing CO2. It's accumulating in the atmosphere, and scientists are worried, okay, maybe this is going to cause some climate changes in the Through the 1970s, there was a lot more scientific work done on climate change. Many of the early computer models that we use today in a more sophisticated form were developed around this time. So we see essentially change that are commissioned by the US government or the National Academy of Sciences and things like this. And they all basically came to the same conclusion. Experience more climate change or less, the basic physics, the basic science was fairly well agreed upon. It's going to cause the Earth to warm up. Now, there's another historical question, which is starting to different petroleum companies know about climate change even back at this point as well. Did they know about it? Did they study it? Were they worried about it? United States, because some oil companies in the United States are now under investigation for maybe knowing about the problem and then not doing anything about it and then misleading, illegal, and they can get in very big trouble. This is what got a lot of cigarette companies in trouble, ultimately in the 1990s. And so something very similar is going on now. So very recently, and this is something that I work on myself in my historical research, is finding documents from the industry to try to determine what they knew about climate change, when they knew it, and how they responded to that knowledge. And this is a very interesting, this is sort of the earliest example that I know of. And you're some of the first people in the world, I think, to know about this particular example, because I just found kind of interesting. But in 1959, the main oil trade association was a physicist, Edward Teller, who is mostly famous for like developing nuclear weapons at the time. he was actually very pessimistic. He said, by that carbon dioxide has increased by more than 10%, although we probably will eventually, and New York City's not covered yet. But this illustrates catastrophic potential, the really disastrous potential of the climate change problem was on the minds of scientists, and they were telling the petroleum industry about it. In the 1960s, after that, the petroleum industry started to study climate change on its own. It began to commission reports from scientists about climate change so that the industry itself knew about the problem and could assess the problem itself. So here's just an example. And this is an example of what it says. It says, significant temperature changes are almost certain to occur by the year 2000. These could bring about climatic changes. There seems to be no doubt that the potential damage to our environment could be severe. The pollutants we generally ignore because they have little local effect, carbon dioxide and submicron particles like PM 2.5, things like that that you might have heard of, sulfate aerosols. They may be the cause of serious worldwide environmental changes. Past and present studies of CO2 are detailed. What is lacking, however, is work towards systems in which CO2 emissions would be brought under control. This is from 1968. Certainty about the basic reality of climate change. But didn't publish publicly. A little bit later, even, the climate change problem. As far as we know, this task force existed from about 1979 to 1983. So the minutes of their meetings, some of their notes. So we have some idea about what they're talking about what they knew. And this is just an example. So this is a meeting that took place in New York City in the airport, LaGuardia Airport in 1980. From Exxon, from Texaco, from Standard Oil of Ohio, and their guest is this person, who's their guest. It's a consultant who's an expert on climate change, and so we have a copy of his presentation, and so we know what he told them, and this is his basic conclusion that he's telling the industry in 1980, that by the 2030s, we'll have about 2.5-degree rise. This could have major economic consequences, he says. And by the 2060s, there could be a 5-degree rise with globally catastrophic effects. So this, in the country or in the world, we're sort of even aware of the issue of climate change, or it's kind of a discussing the potential need to move away from fossil fuels at that time, because it takes a very long time, of course, to change the entire energy system. History of climate change. And I'm sorry if these translations are not very good. I don't know. I just used Google Translate, so like last night. But the history is longer than most people realize. And the petroleum industry, they were aware of the issue by the fuels urge to battle the shift in climate. And maybe it's amazing to us today, but actually the world took pretty fast action, at least at first. So that year in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed, which is this international body of scientists that periodically reports on the state of climate change science. They put out their first report in 1990, 2 years later, and they said, there's a lot of uncertainty about some things, but we are certain of the following. Carbon dioxide will enhance the greenhouse effect, resulting on average in additional warming of the Earth's surface. And of course, that was known for a very long time already, as we saw, even decades beforehand. But this is sort of the most basic thing a person can say about climate change. And they estimated how much warming there would be if we didn't cut back on the use of fossil fuels and replace them with something else. So here's the business as usual scenario. And there's a sort of estimate of around 2 to 6 degrees Celsius rise by the end of the century. In 1992, there was the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, where a very, very major international treaty was written. This is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is actually a legally binding international treaty. And so it remains actually the only treaty, climate treaty, that the United States at least has ever entered into. And it still is technically a part of it. And the goal of the treaty is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentration. Negotiations and meetings around climate change, technically that's what they're trying to accomplish, is to avoid that from happening. Now, of course, that's sort of undefined. What is dangerous? At what level does something become dangerous? We've already seen that we're probably experiencing dangerous impacts of climate change right now already. And so, I don't know, it might be kind of interesting as these get worse that countries like the United States have signed on to this. Elsewhere in the legal document, it says the developed countries shall adopt national policies and take corresponding measures on the mitigation of climate change. The shall is a very important word because it means legally you have to do it if you signed on to this. Now, of course, this is international law, and so, is one country going to sue another or take a country to an international court, and how successful would that be? That's sort of a political question as much as a legal question. But it is sort of interesting that in 1992, 25 years ago, the world kind of sat down and said, we want to avoid what we see today in 2017 from happening. So at the time, maybe we were optimistic, and we're taking rapid action. We were forming these scientific bodies. deny that we knew that much about it to begin with. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples because there are like tons of examples of this. So you can see this sort of like alternate reality. There's like two realities to choose from here. So these are from different US business interests who are writing in the media. Sometimes they're writing in the New York Times or the Washington Post, which are very big newspapers, massive newspapers, reaching a lot of people, TV advertisements. So this example, negotiations to reduce the use of fossil fuels are based on the unproven theory that they affect the Earth's climate. Scientific evidence remains inconclusive as to whether human activities affect global climate. Climate scientists don't say that burning oil, gas, and coal is steadily warming the Earth. There is no convincing evidence that future increases in greenhouse gas concentrations will produce significant climate effects. These are all around 1997 when the world was trying to get the Kyoto Treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, off the ground. So there was a lot of lobbying against that in the United States by different groups. So this is what the public is mostly hearing when they open up the newspaper. So here are the comparisons to what scientists had found, either at the same time or earlier. Carbon dioxide will enhance the greenhouse effect, resulting in additional warming of the Earth's surface. Oops. Balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. That's from the second IPCC report. And this one is really interesting. It says scientific basis for the greenhouse effect and potential impact of human emissions of greenhouse gases like CO2 on climate is well established and cannot be denied. This is actually from the industry's own scientists writing in a memo to the industry representatives. And then they turn around and say this. So there's sort of two versions of reality occurring here. And the question is, I mean, how is the public supposed to choose which one is correct? Most people are not climate scientists, and they can't just like go like do a calculation or something to kind of prove to themselves that the greenhouse effect is real. And this led to a lot of confusion and delay. And a lot of that delay is still occurring. And you might wonder, well, how is it possible that this simple denial, just saying it's not real, how could it be so effective? Well, there's a couple of reasons, but one really important reason is that most of the denial is in popular media, like TV, newspapers, magazines, and most of the science is in scientific reports. And hardly anybody reads those. I mean, even I don't read most of them, and I'm a scientist. So the public is getting a very, very skewed sort of flow of information from different groups. And just a couple of months ago, there was a really important scientific study that was done on this issue by a couple of historians of science at Harvard. And what they did was they looked at ExxonMobil's climate communications. They looked at ExxonMobil's internal papers about climate change, the scientific papers that their scientists were writing, and they also looked at Exxon's public communication. So that's this thing, advertorials. These are basically, it's like an ad that you take out in a newspaper, but you can write, of course, whatever you want in it. And it's a way for communicating with the public. And so for many years, every week, ExxonMobil would take out an ad in the New York Times and talk about climate change. And so here, it looks a little complicated, but the blue is when these documents acknowledge that climate change is real and human-caused. Okay, so most of Exxon's internal documents acknowledge that climate change is real and human caused. Its peer-reviewed documents do too. Its non-peer-reviewed documents a little less, but still mostly do. But then its public communication, things that the general public is reading, mostly doubt that climate change is real and human caused. So you see a really big disparity between what companies know internally and what they're communicating to the public. Oops. I have to restart it. I mean, not from the beginning, but I have to open it up again. Let's see, it's right here. Okay. Let's see. Sorry about that. Okay, so now we're on sort of the last phase of the history. Because today it's actually kind of unusual to hear someone just deny the existence of climate change. You don't see it that much. In the 1990s, it happened all of the time. But today, you don't really see it that much. But something else has happened. It's not so much denial, it's more saying, okay, yes, it's real, but then blocking any effort to do anything about it. So this is a obstruction or blocking sort of phase of history. And it generally works like this, at least in the United States. This is sort of the pattern of obstruction that we see. So usually, not always, but usually it starts with commercial interests, with business interests that don't want strong climate policy because they'll lose money. It's not really complicated. Now, these businesses need some credibility if they're going to communicate with the public. So what they often do is they hire think tanks, economic think tanks or political think tanks, to write reports that say this policy will be really expensive and so we can't do it, or there's a lot of uncertainty about climate change, so let's not do anything until we study it more. So you can kind of create these facts out of thin air, and they cost money. You have to pay somebody to write these reports, but if you have money, you can create these facts, basically. These facts get injected into the public debate through newspaper articles, through op-eds that people write, through advertisements and things like that. Also, just by communicating with Congress and giving them an alternate view of reality, saying, no, actually, we're not certain about climate change, for example. There's also direct advertising to the public through TV ads and things like that. And so what you end up with is you generate electoral pressure on government not to enact strong climate policies. So, for example, there have been some Republican Congress people in the United States who say, we do need to have strong climate policies. And unfortunately, they often don't get reelected. So there is real electoral pressure on these politicians. But then there's also something more, which is also very important, which is that the business interests and the think tanks also directly influence the government by suing government agencies who try to regulate carbon dioxide, by lobbying politicians through campaign donations, or if possible, by infiltrating the government agencies that are supposed to regulate them. And that's basically what's happened now with President Trump, was that a lot of the personnel from different commercial groups or personnel from think tanks that have fought climate policies for many decades, they're now running some of the agencies that are supposed to regulate CO2 or study the climate problem. So they've been very successful at that. So there's a lot of different strategies, and sort of what you get at the end of the day is that there's a lot of pressure put on the government to block climate policy or to control climate policy, so that's not very effective. And so I think one of the important things to realize is that the techniques, the strategies that are used to do this are very sophisticated. They have a lot of very smart, well-paid people behind them to come up with them and execute them and implement them. And there are a lot of organizations and a lot of people that do this because there's a lot of money to be made, or at least to be saved, by not addressing climate change for some people. Now, how many organizations are there who do this? So last year, a sociologist from Yale University tried to map out all of these organizations from the 1990s onward. And so he came up with this blob. You don't have to, I don't exactly understand the blob myself entirely, but the point is that he found that there were over 160 different organizations who are engaging in this activity to block climate policy. And there were over 4,000 individuals associated with them as well. So there's a lot of people. It's not sort of, didn't just spring out of the earth sort of spontaneously. It's a well-run political campaign, essentially. And they've been very successful. So they influenced President Bush a lot. And I was trying to figure out whether the thumbs up sign was like offensive in Latin America, because it is in a lot of places. But if it is, then that's sort of fitting for George Bush, like leaving the Kyoto Protocol. So, and later there was an investigation that also found that the Bush administration was censoring government climate science and preventing climate scientists and the government from speaking to the media about it. Even Barack Obama, who came into office wanting to do a lot about climate change, was mostly blocked. He couldn't get any climate policy pushed through the Congress. His major accomplishments were some executive orders to get the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, to help them, to push them forward to regulate carbon dioxide, and helping push forward the Paris Agreement through agreements with China and things like that to kind of get things going. But of course, you know, there's been a pretty big change since then. And so if all of the action is in one branch of government, if it's just the president, of course the president changes regularly, the party changes regularly. So a lot of those accomplishments are being dismantled and deconstructed right now. So, you know, as you know, the United States has indicated that it may leave the Paris Agreement. I think I saw yesterday that Syria has now signed on to the agreement, which makes the United States the only country in the world that hasn't, except maybe North Korea or something, which is sort of amazing, really, incredible to think about. And then the U.S.'s domestic policies through the Environmental Protection Agency, those are basically being in the process of dismantled or at least blocked from doing anything by the Trump administration. And so these efforts, which have basically occurred since the early 1990s, they've occurred for the last 25 years or so, they've been very effective at blocking progress. So I don't want to make you too depressed. So like, what do we do? Where do we go from here? So I think that there are a couple areas of progress that have occurred in the last 5 years that are very promising. And I hope that they and maybe some other things will be enough to stop this history of obstruction, that we can actually make progress. So the first one is we have seen a lot of social movements that have risen up, have been developed just over the last 5 years or so to address the issue of climate change. Because even though we knew about climate change since, well, you know, the 1960s, say, there weren't really popular social movements to do anything about it. It was mostly government working on it, scientists working on it, and industry being concerned about it. But regular people weren't marching in the streets and making it a big political issue and voting based on climate change. But that's starting to change. And so that's really hopeful, I think. I think another really important development is that a lot of the major religions of the world are starting to think about climate change in a really serious way. You know, of course, this is also sort of a spiritual issue, because if we think that our lives mean something more than just living and dying, if we want to leave something behind or do something meaningful, then we're starting to realize that we have to think about and address this issue of climate change too, because it's going to affect the world for a very long time. And so here's just one example. I know other religious leaders are also engaging with the climate issue, but I highly recommend reading Pope Francis's encyclical on climate. I think it's one of the best documents about climate change that has ever been written by anybody, like ever. I think it's really good, and I highly recommend it. We also see that the courts are starting to wake up about climate change too, because of course climate change hurts people, and it does it in a lot of unjust ways. And so that's supposed to be what the courts are made to address. And so they're starting to take action too. So this is just an example. I mentioned it earlier, that some of the most powerful lawyers in the United States, the attorneys general, are investigating different oil companies in this case for maybe deceiving the public, for misleading the public about this issue. And so I think that's important because, one, if it is found that they did, then that history becomes much clearer for people. Like if we see that, oh my gosh, the people who are telling me that this wasn't a problem knew about this decades ago, then it becomes really clear that this really is a problem. And I think it also could help to change the politics a little bit and weaken some of the commercial interests that are fighting really hard to prevent climate policies from being enacted. And then the fourth thing is technology. We've seen very, very big changes in clean energy technology in the last decade. This is just one example, photovoltaics or solar power. Here, this is the price of solar since the 1970s, so a while ago. But you can see it's declined, and it's getting very low now. It's continuing to decline, and this is the growth of solar power globally. And so over the last decade or so, solar has had a growth rate of like 30 to 40% compounded annually. That's really fast for any industry to grow that fast. That means that the size of the industry doubles every 2 or 3 years. And so the longer this happens, the longer we have this rapid growth, the cheaper and cheaper it gets as well, because it's a mass-produced commodity. It's like computer chips and stuff like that. So I think that's really, really promising. And so even if the politics remains difficult, I think the politics will always remain sort of difficult. Hopefully it'll get a little better. But the economics will also improve, hopefully. So finally, the last thing is, what can we do? What can we do, us who are in this room today? And I think there are many things we can do, but I just wanted to point out just 2 things. So first is professionally. So as medical professionals, I think you have a huge opportunity to communicate to government and the public about the health impacts of climate change. The more that people understand this, the more that people will want to do something about it too. I think just a couple of weeks ago, there was a really big review article in The Lancet, and it's all about the health impacts of climate change. And so that might be something that some people are interested in. And then the other thing is, I think politically, it is important to exert pressure politically as well. Now, everybody kind of feels differently about this, especially professionals. It can feel, some professionals don't want to become politically active for some reasons. But the thing is, if we don't exert political pressure, then we probably won't achieve the policies that we need to address the issue in time. So just one suggestion is to join or support organizations that are fighting for clean energy development, because the development of clean energy is probably the single most important thing for addressing climate change. And so I'll leave you with that. This issue will affect the world for probably hundreds of years, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a very long time, or at least a fraction of it does. But we sort of have an opportunity here. I mean, we're kind of lucky when you think about it that we live right now, because we are living in a time when we can actually do something about it. If we think ahead 30 years, we won't be able to go back in time and do something about it today. So it's like a lot of things in life, you can't go back and change things. So let's do something about it. And so thank you very much for coming, and I hope it was interesting, and I hope you learned about the history a little bit, and or maybe renewed with some motivation too to address the issue. So thank you, and if there's time for any questions, I'd be happy to take some. Let's see, is there time? Should we have a question, or? Oh, yeah.
Ayer que estuve hablando con el doctor Congo, mientras almorzaba, él nos dijo que se había firmado, el gobierno estaba tratando de firmar un acuerdo con la Embajada de Japón, porque Japón ya no usa energía nuclear a raíz de Fukushima. Todo solo uno quedó, y ahora todo es geotermia. Tienen como 167 estaciones de geotermia. Y aquí ya van a hacer una en el Miravalles con ayuda de los japoneses. Mañana el ingeniero Carlos Mesa, del Tecnológico, va a hablar sobre energías limpias. Y va a ver todo esto que está haciendo el Tecnológico para la energía eólica, los paneles solares, etc. Él también canta en el coro y toca piano. Y es católico. Por eso le gusta la encíclica del Papa Francisco. Pregunte si...
Dr. Daniel,